Thank you for the welcome. It's not just going to be me speaking, but Stuart and I are going to share the various sessions that we're doing together. This was something that Sian and I had planned for a couple of reasons. If you've had the benefit of being ministered to by Sian before or read any of the things that she's written on her own or with Stuart, you'll know that the whole notion of multi-voiced worship is something that's quite important to her. And it was something that we wanted to model, a sort of male voice and a female voice sharing the same sessions together. Ever so grateful that Stuart stepped in. He can do many things. However, he's not capable of being a female, but we're still nonetheless going to share this. Stuart, you are a very intelligent man whose ministry and writing has blessed me immensely. Jill said we've been working hard to complement each other. So that's my compliment to you. I wait in eager anticipation. Jill, you're not the only one who gets lost. I found myself in one of the rooms down over in the main building for a while thinking this is where I was supposed to be looking around thinking I can't believe it's not Butterley. But somebody put me right and sent me in the right direction. The various talks that Stuart and I are going to share together begin with readings of scripture from Matthew's Gospel, 3 short passages from 3 parts of the Gospel. Each of which points us in the direction of something that Jesus seems to indicate was very significant. And so our first session looks at the Great Commandment, and the reading is from Matthew's Gospel 22:37 to 39. In fact, I'm going to take it back a little bit further than that, and we'll start from verse 34. When the Pharisees had heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. I don't know if you have role models or heroes in ministry, people whose ministry you've admired and who you've sought to reflect in some way or another. It is said that we all end up in ministry for one of 2 reasons. We see somebody ministering and we think either, I could do that, or I could do that better than they're doing it. One of the people who inspired me and remained a bit of a role model for a number of years is a minister who's still alive now, living down in Surrey, but long retired. He's well into his 90s. In fact, I think he might be 100 next year. I don't know if there's anybody here who ever knew Mick Dennison. Trained at Bristol Baptist College and ministered for many long years at Barnsley Baptist Church, where my second pastorate was in the other church in town. Mick was a great Baptist minister in the old sense of that word. He basically preached on a Sunday, led God's people in worship, spent his mornings in the study preparing, his afternoons visiting, and his evenings at meetings. And that was it. Never heard him preach a bad sermon, rarely heard him preach even an average sermon. He was well loved by the people he visited and was diligent and appropriately Baptist in meetings. Mick wasn't one for leadership. Mick's view was that he was the pastor to the congregation and the leadership rested in the hands of other people. Great, impressive man of God. Actually, it occurs to me this is going to be up on the website, isn't it? So if by any chance, Mick, you get to hear this, I mean that. You've been a great blessing. But I suspect that Mick was trained for ministry in simpler days. And I've certainly learned to my own cost, and I've seen in others, that ministry is a much more complex reality. And working out what it means to minister in a fast-changing world is a complex challenge. Which is precisely why what I want to do and the inputs that I want to bring over these 3 sessions is, if I can, to help you to simplify ministry, and not for the sake of simplicity, but for the sake of discovering and concentrating upon that which matters most. Some of you will be aware of the Swiss philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who has a delightful little concept. He talks about a second naivety. How often when we engage with theological truth, or in his case he's talking about texts, we read them at face value, we come up with clear understanding about which we're incredibly enthusiastic, and then life happens and complexity happens, and we recognize the need to move beyond that naive approach to our theology and that naive approach to the text that we read, including the biblical text, that it's not quite as straightforward as we first imagined, and Ricoeur encourages in that direction. But he says beyond that complexity there is ultimately a second naivety, where having passed through complexity we begin to recover the foundational principles that matter most. And we hold them with an enriched simplicity, but a simplicity nonetheless. Now, whether Ricoeur would approve of the things that I'm going to do with you in these few sessions, I don't know. Whether we manage to achieve a second naivety, I don't know. But that is my aim. And that's why I want to look at this particular passage, because it seems to me that one of the things that Jesus does here is he cuts to the chase and he simplifies things. We enter the passage and we encounter Jesus in the midst of a controversy that was a live controversy amongst the people of God in Palestine in Jesus' day. One of the sad things that's happened over this past year. It is within the year that Alan died, isn't it, Stuart? Alan Kreider passed away, and that's a great loss to the church. I don't know how many of you ever read his book on Journey Towards Holiness. Some books impress you, and some books impress you and shape you. And one of the things that I've taken away from Alan's book on holiness was the way in which he described the political milieu of Jesus' ministry, and the fact that within Judaism of Jesus' day in Palestine, a big issue which many parties were struggling with is how do you stay faithful to God when the land is occupied by a pagan army under the power of a pagan empire, and soldiers with pagan symbols are marching through your holy city and desecrating it? How can we be Israel when Israel is under the thumb of Rome? And in that book, Alan very helpfully points out that there were various parties disputing what it meant to be the holy people of God in those circumstances. The Sadducees, their program was that what you needed to do was to keep safe the temple and the temple sacrifices, and as long as that happened, we were okay. The Zealots, well, their motto was rise up and kill a Roman. You stay holy by physically, violently attacking the Romans and throwing them out. It's interesting that ultimately the Zealot party is the party that won the debate. The Essenes, well, their program was you can't do it, so run away and start a community in the desert. A community of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Pharisees, whose program was that you stick as carefully and as closely as possible to every letter of the law, and that is the way to remain faithful. And Jesus, of course, was closest to the Pharisees. That's why they fell out so much. Those are the people with whom we tend to have our arguments, those who are nearest. The problem with the Pharisees, as we encounter them in the Synoptic Gospels, despite the question with which they come to Jesus here, is that they were so focused on obeying everything in the law that they were in danger of losing sight of the main thing in the law. They treat the word of God as something flat and boring like Lincolnshire, rather than beautifully contoured like Derbyshire. They were so intent on the everything, that they lost sight of the main thing. In practice. Despite the question with which they come to Jesus here. And it's a remarkable moment in the ministry of Jesus, is this. Because Jesus actually gives a straight answer to a straight question. Which, if you read the Gospels, is virtually unknown. Who is my neighbour? Well, there was a Samaritan. Should we worship in Jerusalem or in Samaria? Well, those who worship God need to worship God in spirit and in truth. Incidentally, there are a lot of people out there who will tell you that what they're looking for from the church is a straight answer to a straight question. Those kind of people would have been unhappy with Jesus. It was H.L. Mencken, I think, the North American journalist, who said, to every simple question, there's an answer which is simple, straightforward, and wrong. Well, for once, Jesus gives a straight answer to a straight question. What's the greatest commandment? What's the thing that God demands above everything else? What does God want of his people most? What does God want of your churches most? What does God want of you in your discipleship most? Above everything else? The top thing? The main thing? Well, love God with everything you've got. Love God with everything you've got. Traditionally, Judaism lists 613 commands in the Torah. We mustn't ignore them. But neither must we treat them as if they're equally important. They're not, Jesus said. And what goes for the Torah goes for the rest of the Bible as well. Let me try it out on you, see what happens. Not everything in the Bible is equally important. If you wish to leave now, you may. I'm sufficiently arrogant to believe it will be your loss. Deuteronomy itself, from which Jesus quotes as he quotes the Shema, singles out this one commandment as the greatest. This is what matters most. This is your God, love him. That's what matters most. That's the most thing. That's the important thing. Straight answer to a straight question. Or is it? Were you listening? Because the answer's not quite that straight, is it? Because Jesus was only asked for one. Which is the greatest? Which one, Jesus? And it starts off as a straight answer, but then this being Jesus, there was, of course, a twist in the tail. Because he can't bring himself just to give one answer. Because that one answer on its own doesn't quite work. It needs the second part of the answer as well. And not only do you have to love God with everything that you've got, but you've got to love other people the same way. It's quite the daring thing that Jesus does, to take the Shema and add to it, embellish it, gloss it, comment on it, refuse to have it stand on its own. I know you only want one, but I'm going to give you two, because the two need each other. Love God with everything that you've got, and love all those little images of God in the same way. You do know, don't you, why neither Judaism nor Christianity were supposed to make images of God? It's because we've got enough already. Just turn to the person next to you, look at them lovingly in the eye, and say to them, you are an image of God. I didn't actually expect you to do that, but thank you. And that applies, of course, to every other human being that you come across. Everybody in your church. Yes, even them. They are images of God that you're called to love with everything that you've got, just as you're called to love God. Loving God is crucial. There are forms of ministry which descend into nothing less than glorified forms of charity work. There are forms of Christian ministry that become nothing other than glorified versions of social work. That's not what we're called to. We're called to be people whose love of other people arises out of a profound devotion to and service to and passion for God himself. But without that indiscriminate, passionate love of whoever we come across, then we're in danger of something far worse than becoming charity workers or social workers. We're in danger of becoming religious bigots. And actually, I think we're more in danger than that than most of us realise. I think the church needs to be in confession mode with regard to many people in our community. Met somebody a while ago from the community where our church is set. And we got talking about church, and he said, no, I daren't go to church. If I set foot in there, I don't know what would happen. Now, I don't know why he came to feel like that, but isn't it tragic? A passionate love for God that isn't echoed in a love for whoever God brings across our path leads us down that track of becoming religious bigots. The kind of people who are so concerned to be correct that we forget to be kind. I don't think it's a choice we're meant to make between the one or the other. But I suspect if we asked Jesus which way we wanted to get it wrong, I think I know which way he would vote. Forgetting that opens up a path which at its extreme leads to not the preservation of faith, but the perversion of faith. And in its worst, it leads to ISIS. It leads to the Ku Klux Klan. Have you seen The Black Klansman? The film? Watch it. Watch it, and watch it to the end. Isn't it nice hearing Rochelle play the clarinet? The guitars and the box thing's good as well. But you can't beat a nice woodwind instrument. You see from my profile that I'm a keen and enthusiastic sax player. Those are the most appropriate adjectives to apply to it. And the guy who plays alongside me at band has been aware for years that I'm a Christian and I'm a minister, but then he discovered a few weeks ago that I'm a Baptist, and he got worried. Perfectly nice, intelligent guy. But to him, Baptist is pretty close to bigot. Now, I'm not saying it's all our fault. But if ever we get to that place where correctness matters more than kindness, well, I said I wanted to keep it simple, and I'm also determined to keep it short, to give Stuart a fair crack of the whip. So let me be simple. The first thing that you're called to do is to walk the way of Christ. And to do that, you need two legs. Left leg, love God. Right leg, love other people. Left leg, right leg. Left leg, right leg. Keep walking, and you'll not go far wrong. Jesus said, The whole of the Bible is important, but not every bit is equally important. God is interested in what we do, but he's not equally interested in everything that we do. It's not that the other stuff doesn't matter, but this stuff matters most. Jesus said. And the scriptures go on saying it, don't they? Don't we? This is how everyone will be able to tell that you're my disciples. The greatest thing is, if I have not love, then I am. For God so, and God is. Never says God is truth, never says God is justice. God is true, God is just, and so are all the ways of God. But it only ever says that God is love. And love is not a feeling to be worked up or a grim duty. It's a skill to be practiced like a musician. You know how they can identify medieval archers when they dig up a skeleton? Have any ever dug up a medieval archer? I'm told there's a surefire way you can tell, even if all you've got left is bones, is that you've got an archer. Does anybody know? They've got really big right shoulder bones because of all the practice that they did pulling the longbow. The musculature builds up and the body responds to that by laying down more calcium in the bones, and the bones get bigger and thicker. And if you've got a medieval skeleton, this might come in handy one day, and you want to know if it's an archer or not, just look at the size of the right shoulder bones. Clunky illustration, you can see where this is going, can't you? If anybody ever digs up a Christian, who we are is shaped by the things that we practice. And we need to practice loving God by paying him deliberate attention. By doing things like saying grace, by worshipping publicly, by praying regularly, by giving God deliberate attention and practicing it and practicing it and practicing it and practicing it, and consciously opening our eyes to the God who is present as regularly and as deliberately as we possibly can. And we need to practice the prioritizing of the other in those 1,000 little mustard seed decisions that we'll have to make. I'm serious. Decide that you will open that door for the other person. It's only a tiny little practice. It's only a mustard seed size practice. And practice by volunteering to make that cup of tea again. By buying the next round, even though it's her turn, which it is, and it has been for weeks. By not flushing the toilet in the ensuite at night because you know that it backs onto next door's bedroom and they've just had a baby. Sorry, that's probably a bit too much information, isn't it? Practice refusing to treat anybody as a means to an end. Every human being is an end in themselves. That's not Jesus, that's Kant. But I think I can hear Jesus saying amen. Practice loving other people by refusing to badmouth anyone, even on Baptist Collaboration. Whatever you it's an awful place at times, that place, isn't it? You're going to leave you on Baptist Collaboration. Yeah? It's where all the Baptist whingers hang out. Including me sometimes. The love of God and the love of neighbour is the double heartbeat of the Jesus-shaped life. Ba-bum, Ba-bum, ba-bum. The love of God and the love of neighbour is the life breath of discipleship. It's even more important than triangles and circles. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. The love of God and the love of neighbour is the left leg and the right leg of Christian discipleship. Love God, love others, keep walking. Get this wrong, and all the other stuff that you get right no longer matters. Well-established homiletical technique. If there's something you say you want them to remember, say it twice. Get this wrong, and the stuff that you've got right no longer matters. It's the most important thing of all. It's the greatest commandment. Jesus said. Now I know you know this, and if you were expecting something new or remotely clever, I'm sorry, not really. Because I also know how in the complexity of ministry it's easy to forget and for other things to come to matter more. So easy. So please remember, and let me be simple. Derbyshire, not Lincolnshire. Other stuff, yes, but this most of all. Love God, love others. Atria, ventricles, contract, relax. That was ventricles. Breathe in, breathe out. Inhale, exhale. Left leg, right leg. Keep walking. It's what matters most, because Jesus said. Amen. Okay.
Is this working? Yes. One of the dangers of having two speakers is you just get a lot of words from the front and no opportunity to process. So I think we should just take a few moments to respond in a variety of ways, perhaps to what Glen's been saying before I throw anything else in. You may want to do that by just talking to the person next to you. You might just want to do it quietly. But I think just for 2 or 3 minutes it'd be good. What have you heard so far? What has God been saying to you? What are you going to take away even from the first half hour of this conference? Okay, let me draw you back together again. I do apologise for not being Sian, and I certainly can't bring the kind of contribution that she would have made. Sian and I have worked quite a bit together. We are very different in our style of presentation and the kinds of things that we would offer. And when I agreed to take over from her, I knew, and she knew, that I would not be able to bring what she would have brought. So my apologies for that, and apologies also that it's probably my fault that she's not here, in that I had a heavy cold last week and very generously passed that on, and she is much worse than I was. I just had a touch of man flu, but she really is quite unwell. Recovering, I think, a bit today, but she is very sorry not to be here. What compliment can I play Glen? Do you know, we've known each other a long time, but we haven't actually worked together very much. This is quite unusual and quite a privilege, really. I think the encouraging that Sian said to me was, "Oh, Glen's a great communicator," as if that was going to encourage me, that somehow I'd be struggling. And the very kind suggestion that we have spent a lot of hours over the last couple of days working on this together is slightly missing the mark. We did have a phone conversation and exchanged a couple of emails. So we hope it'll fit together, but you'll be the judge of that. So the great commandment, to love God and to love our neighbour. And as Glen said, Jesus almost gave a straight answer, but not quite. 2 instead of 1. Well, I want to push it a bit further and suggest he actually gave 3 answers. Or rather, he defined the second answer in ways that was unexpected. When he was asked, "Well, Jesus, who do you mean by my neighbour?" Jesus told a story about enemies. Love God love your neighbour, love your enemy. All of those seem to be aspects of this great double or treble commandment. Now, this is a wonderful picture of right leg, left leg. Can I add a third leg? A tripod. You can't go very far with 3 legs, but perhaps that's pushing the image as far as it'll go. But I want us to think a little bit for a while about enemy loving. Perhaps the sharp end of loving your neighbour. And I want to read you a terrible psalm, a dreadful psalm. A psalm that is very difficult to read in public worship. Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator. Happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Amen. Well, that's where it ends. An awful psalm. Dreadful psalm. And no resolution at the end. No nice happy bit at the end to bring us all round again. It's hard to imagine anything further away from enemy loving than this psalm. It's full of grief, of anger, of bitterness, of blame, of resentment, and the desire for vengeance. God, please, will you take the infants of our tormentors and will you beat out their brains on rocks? It's the cry of exiles in Babylon and throughout the centuries. It's the cry of refugees and migrants and displaced peoples. And we live in a time when we are experiencing the greatest movement of people since the Second World War, when millions of people are on the move, fleeing from famine, from economic hardship, from war, from disaster, many of them losing their lives en route, as we know. I think we need to meditate on Psalm 137 in this context. We need to hear the cry of the refugee, of the migrants, of the exile. And in a culture that is full of hate speech, we need to meditate on this psalm. We've heard some more of that hate speech even in the news today. It seems as if we're becoming more and more polarized in our society. Psalm 137 isn't easy. It's hard. I remember preaching on this a few years ago, and somebody else was doing the reading for me, and he came up to me and he said, "You don't want me to read the last verse, do you?" I do. We need to take this in its rawness. Not because we endorse it, not because we think it's right, but because we need to understand it. We need to understand the passion and the rawness and the vitriol and the sheer pain of it all. And the psalm itself gives no answer. There is no resolution. There is no turning it round. Very often in the psalms, it seems very grim. Then you get something at the end that brings it all round. But nothing here. But there is a biblical response, and it's found in Jeremiah's prophecy. In Jeremiah chapter 29, the letter that the prophet sends to the exiles in Babylon, to people like this who are frightened and angry, who want to go home but can't go home, who want to take vengeance but have no power to do that. And Jeremiah writes to these exiles. It's a passage to which many commentators have turned in recent years to reflect on the realities of what many are calling post-Christendom. That there are analogies between Israel in exile in Babylon and the church in the West, moving into a strange new world. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Many people are using this as a resource to help us to think through, well, how might we respond in exile? How might we live in a strange land? How do we sing God's song in this new place? These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. It said, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives to your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city to which I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." And that word welfare is a fairly weak translation of the word shalom, that great Old Testament word. We'll come back to that. And Jeremiah has very clear instructions for the exiles. He knows that false prophets have been saying to them, no need to worry, you'll soon be going home. You haven't got to learn the language of Babylon, you haven't got to adapt to the culture, you haven't got to do anything apart from just wait a little bit longer and you'll soon be going home. And Jeremiah says very strongly in this passage, they're lying. They're dreaming their own dreams. I, the Lord, have not sent them, God says through Jeremiah. We would love an easy answer very often. In the post-Christendom world, the challenges that we're facing are huge. And one of the temptations is to look for plug-in and play programs, easy solutions, quick hits, things that will somehow get us out of this. Jeremiah says to the exiles, settle down. You're going to be there for a while. You need to learn the language. You need to understand the culture. You need to find a way of thriving in this new context. Don't hanker for the past. Don't have unrealistic expectations for the future. It's not that you do nothing. You've got some houses to build. You've got some gardens to plant. You've got to dig deep. There's a community to sustain. There's actually room for growth. But settle down and take the long haul. It's going to be a while. And trust the God who brought you to this place. Did you hear that emphasis in the passage? Yes, Nebuchadnezzar brought them there. They knew that historically, but twice God says through Jeremiah, I, the Lord, have brought you here. This is my purpose. God is going to do things in Babylon that God couldn't do in Jerusalem. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and see remarkable things that happened then. This was probably the time when what we know as the Old Testament was formed and reformed as Israel drew on its ancient scriptures and its stories and reshaped them to give them the resource they needed in this context. This was probably the time, many scholars think, when the synagogue developed, the synagogue that in many ways then became the precursor of the early churches. A fresh expression of temple, you could say. What do you do when there is no institution? Well, you find other ways of worshipping, and the synagogue emerges, creative. This was the time when the theology expanded and exploded. He was no longer just Yahweh, the God of Israel, but the God of Babylon as well, the God of all the earth. All kinds of theological, missiological, ecclesiological developments and discoveries. Who knows what we might discover as we move through the strange land of post-Christendom? Maybe there are analogies. It's not a perfect match, it never is. But there's enough here, I think, to give us pause for thought. I have brought you to this place. It's not a mistake, it's not a disaster, it's part of the journey. And then we get to the tough call, and this is really where we come back to that great commandment. The toughest thing that Jeremiah says, it's hard enough to say to them, look, settle down, you're not going anywhere soon. But here's the really tough thing. Remember the exiles wanting to beat up babies? And Jeremiah says to them, seek the shalom of the city to which I've taken you. Seek the peace and prosperity, the welfare of the city to which I have brought you. Or learn to love your enemies. Develop a vision of blessing, not just for your community, but for the whole community. Translated into our context, perhaps that means church growth is not enough. Flourishing Christian communities is not enough. Our vision has to be bigger than that. A vision of shalom for our neighborhood, for our community, for our nation, for our world. So maybe as we reflect on the Great Commandment, on the three-legged journey of discipleship, maybe one of the questions that we need to focus on is, well, who are our enemies? Love God, love your neighbor. And then when Jesus was asked to define neighbor, he talked about enemies. So who are our enemies? It's a hard question to ask because quite often we think, oh, I haven't got any enemies. Well, let's be honest with ourselves. Who do we find it difficult to love? Within our families, our church communities, our neighborhoods, public figures. So much hate language directed against public figures. It's so easy to slip into that. Who do we find it hard to pray for rather than against? Maybe we just need to reflect on that as we think about this great double, treble commandment. What does it mean to love our enemies? Who are they? Can we be honest about that? And how do we engage with those that we find it hardest to love? Part of the problem of preparing at the very last minute for a conference is you haven't got time to put the jokes in. So you'll have to get the jokes off Glen. He's got plenty of them, and I appreciate that. This has sounded a bit solemn, but I think it's a really important aspect of what we're talking about. The Great Commandment is not easy. It never was intended to be. And it's the sharpening of the edge that I think sometimes we need when we think about the loving of the enemies. It's relatively easy to love those who love us. But those who irritate us, who get under our skin, who say nasty things about us, who have policies that we don't like, who just seem to be the antithesis of everything we want to see happen. What does it mean to love them? Glen mentioned a very good friend of ours, Alan Kreider, who died recently. And some of you will have met Alan and his wife Eleanor. They were in the UK for 30 years. And I remember being struck probably 4 or 5 years ago now, no, longer than that, when Eleanor Kreider, in an email, talked about the way that she was learning to love George Bush. At a time when everybody was simply so negative about him. What does it mean to love our enemies? What does it mean to love those that we find it hard to respect? Those we find it hard to agree with on anything? What does it mean to love Donald Trump? To love Theresa May, bless her. To love Jeremy Corbyn, wherever on the spectrum you would find it hardest. What does it mean to love them, to pray for them, to seek their blessing, to seek shalom? Doesn't get much harder than that, does it? I don't know what time we're stopping, or we done? Who's in charge here? oh, yeah. Okay. Have you got your own? Oh, no.
Shall we just maybe have a moment's quiet prayer? I think that kind of particular challenge to who are the people that we find hardest to love and what would it mean to love them. Shall we just stay with that thought for a minute or two? And let me encourage you to see a face, to put a name to it. And I know for some of us this will actually be painful. Because the thing about enemies is that they hurt us. But let's just call them to mind. And then remembering the first rule of prayer is never lie to God. Just articulate to God in your own heart whatever it is that you can manage to articulate at the minute. And loving God, you see all the faces and all the names that we have in our minds. And you do love them. And in our better moments, we would love them too. But as in all our moments, we need your grace. Spirit of God, would you grant us the grace to begin to love like Jesus? Even that person, even that group, even those, even them. Would you draw near? Would you touch our hearts? Would you lay hold of our weak wills? Would you teach us to love our God, our neighbour, and our enemies? In Jesus' name, amen.